We are witnessing an historic presidency as President Trump asserts his executive authority in the courts, on the media, on immigration policy. Even the power of the purse is assigned to Congress. And we're seeing the pushback, as evidenced by last weekend's No Kings rallies across the nation, including in Portland. Thousands of Americans taking a stand against the direction this administration is taking. And there's pushback against the pushback, as the president's supporters label those demonstrations Hate America rallies. So where are we politically as a nation? Associate Professor Ben Gaskins is chair of the Political Science Department at Lewis and Clark College. His areas of expertise include the presidency, American political parties, and religion's intersection with the political world. Professor Gaskins, thanks for coming back to Eye on Northwest Politics.
Thanks for having me, Ken.
Well, President Trump seems to be testing the limits of his presidential power. Is that how you see it?
Absolutely. All of the scholars of the presidency that I'm following are really noting that even though presidents in the past have sought to really have expansive authority within the executive branch, to have a lot of discretion over how to apply congressional policy and funding that is appropriated by Congress, President Trump is really taking that to a new level and really saying that he is the executive branch. And as far even beyond that, has control and discretion over policies from even institutions that are nominally independent, like the Federal Reserve, the CDC, even the Smithsonian museums, and that every bureaucrat from the highest to the lowest needs to be actively involved in supporting the president's agenda and the president's wishes. And if they provide any kind of resistance to that, we've seen that the president is willing to put pressure on them to be fired and even approaching legal action against those that he sees as getting in the way of his agenda. And so from that perspective, this presidency is even more, I think, pursuing unitary power compared to even his past presidency, over 4 years ago. And so I think that is giving a lot of political scientists and observers some pause for whether or not there are any real constraints on what this president is able and willing to do.
Have we seen anything like this in history?
Absolutely. I think in certain times and in certain eras of crisis, we've seen presidents really assert expansive powers over domestic surveillance, over war-making power, and so on. After 9/11, for example, there was a huge discussion of whether or not George W. Bush was reemerging in an imperial presidency. But I think this is qualitatively different in that there is no kind of existential crisis that is facing the country, and that President Trump is effectively asserting these powers and asserting emergency so that he can have more power, more centralized power for basically day-to-day operations. And there seem to be fewer constraints on his exercise of power and assertions of power from Congress, from the Supreme Court, or from his own administration. The last time he was president, there were more members of his administration that seemed to put up roadblocks for President Trump doing whatever he wished to do. And now in this second term, he has really, I think, incentivized loyalty and chosen people to be part of his administration that would go along with effectively whatever he wants to see done. And so far, we've seen a presidency that is fairly unconstrained by any of the normal political guardrails that other presidents have held and kept in place.
Well, supporters would say, well, the president gets things done, and this is the way you get things done. How do you view that?
Absolutely. And I think we've seen for many years a lot of dissatisfaction with Congress and its inability to get things done. And so if you are the supporter of whoever is the president, there is often an impulse to want the president to do as much as possible with the relatively short amount of time they are in power. And so this is, I think, a continuation of that. But I think, again, President Trump is just a different president from any of the presidents we've seen in the past, in that he really takes personal control or seeks personal control over all elements of federal policy, sees Congress more of as an advisory body rather than the body that creates law, that appropriates money. And so we're seeing some, exertions of power that we really haven't seen since, Richard Nixon and again, George W. Bush on a routine basis basis. And I think there are some, there's reason to give pause to that, even if you are a supporter of President Trump, that this sets a precedent that when there is a different president in power, you may not be as supportive of. And so I think that is a big concern with the state of the presidency right now.
The president has taken academic institutions to task for what he calls woke ideology, DEI initiatives, even pulling research and program grants. Are you seeing any of that at Lewis and Clark? Is it having an effect?
Well, Lewis and Clark is a little bit insulated from that in that we don't have as many of these large federal research grants as a research institution might. But there are certainly many of my colleagues that have gotten grants from federal institutions, the National Institute of Health, the National Association of Humanities, that are worried about funding for their research and also whether or not higher education is going to be supported by this administration to provide student loans and access to the ability to go to college. And so I think all of higher education, from liberal arts schools like Lewis and Clark to large research institutions, are very concerned about the ability to attract students. Students from abroad, for example, represent a huge chunk of what American academic institutions pull from, and their ability to engage in the day-to-day research that academics do, and the funding sources that have long been available, like the National Science Foundation, that now are coming into question, or the concern is that they are becoming politicized. And so if you do research that runs afoul of the ideology that this president has, that your grants, your ability to do your work will be undermined. And so I think there are broad concerns about the state of academia and this kind of culture war that is going on against colleges and universities that are accused of spreading ideology or an agenda that the president disagrees with.
Got a couple of minutes here, but I want to get to this. We see how states, including Oregon, are fighting back against the administration. Our Attorney General Dan Rayfield, for example, has filed or joined in at least 37 lawsuits against the president's executive orders. State of Illinois files suits against the deployment of the National Guard troops in Chicago. California filing lawsuits on several fronts. So how would you characterize this tug of war between state sovereignty and the presidency?
I think this is a really fascinating area of the law that we really haven't seen as much recently. This really profound battle between blue states in particular and the national administration. And I think it's really going to come down to what the courts are going to do and how they are going to settle these disputes. We've seen that Trump was really able to remake a lot of the federal judiciary over his first term, especially on the Supreme Court. And right now, the Supreme Court seems to be fairly committed to allowing the president to do much of what he wants, especially when it comes to the deployment of federal forces, of addressing funding issues and controlling those kinds of things. And so there really does seem to be the impulse from the federal judiciary, at least at the highest levels, to allow the president a lot of latitude. But this is an ongoing battle that states will have. And it remains to be seen, I think, how ultimately these issues will play out and whether or not, again, the judiciary will put any guardrails on the presidential administration, or whether or not states are going to have to go it alone and do whatever they can to resist policies that they find encroach upon their own territories.
Professor Ben Gaskins, thank you very much for joining Eye on Northwest Politics.
Thank you for having me.